He went into the Alaskan interior the way men like him always did. Quietly, confidently, without telling anyone more than necessary. A seasonal hunter. Not reckless, not chasing legend. He had built the cabin himself years earlier, a single-room structure tucked deep beyond maintained trails, reachable only by snowmobile in winter or days of hiking when the ground softened. He went there every autumn. Same supplies, same habits. When he left, he always locked the door. In October, 5 years ago, he never came back. At first, no one worried. Weather delays were common. Radio silence meant nothing in a place where distance swallowed signals whole. But by the third week, concern hardened into procedure. State troopers were notified. Bush pilots scanned the region. Search teams pushed as far as conditions allowed before winter sealed the ground. They found the cabin. Locked. Windows intact. Supplies inside untouched. His rifle gone, expected. His boots gone, expected. No blood, no sign of struggle. The door was closed, bolted from the inside. It looked exactly like it did every year. He left for a hunt. They assumed he'd gone out and never returned. Alaska held people that way. Took them into weather, water, animals, terrain too wide to argue with. The case was logged as a probable wilderness fatality. No body recovered. No mystery worth reopening. 5 winters passed. Snow collapsed and rebuilt the cabin's outline over and over. Trees shifted. Trails vanished. The structure stood untouched, preserved by cold and isolation. No one visited it. No reason to. Until the spring thaw, a wildlife survey team flew over the region to map migration patterns. One of them recognized the coordinates from an old briefing. An abandoned hunting cabin, logged but never dismantled. As they circled low, something caught the pilot's attention. The door was open. Not broken. Not forced. Open. Hanging inward. They landed nearby. The cabin smelled wrong. Not decay, not rot, but stale air suddenly disturbed. Dust lay thick everywhere, except one narrow path. From the door to the center of the room. As if someone had been standing there recently. The bolt that once held the door shut was still intact. Undamaged. From the inside, nothing was missing. Nothing was added, except the chair. It had been moved, turned to face the door, as if someone had been waiting. The survey team didn't touch anything. They backed out of the cabin slowly, the way people do when instinct moves faster than protocol. No one said it out loud, but all of them felt the same wrongness. Not fear exactly, but the sense of having interrupted something unfinished. State troopers were flown in the next morning. They documented everything with methodical care. The hinges showed no stress. The lock mechanism was functional. There were no animal tracks leading in or out, despite soft ground that should have recorded them clearly. The door had not been pried. It had not warped open with time. It had been opened. From the inside, the interior told a story that didn't line up with 5 years of abandonment. Dust-coated shelves, bunks, and counters evenly, undisturbed. Spiderwebs stretched clean and unbroken across corners. But the floor between the door and the chair showed scuff marks. Light, shallow, recent. Not enough to identify footwear, just enough to suggest movement. The chair itself was familiar, the same wooden chair visible in old photographs from previous searches. Back then, it had been tucked under the small table, angled toward the wall. Now it faced the door directly, centered, as if positioned with intention. The legs rested evenly. No drag marks. It had been lifted, not pushed. Troopers searched the surrounding area in widening circles. No body. No tracks. No equipment. The forest held its silence too well. When they compared the new photographs to the originals from 5 years earlier, another detail surfaced: the stove. It hadn't been used recently. No ash, no warmth. But the damper was open. It hadn't been that way before. Someone had adjusted it, long after the cabin had supposedly become empty. The case was reopened quietly. Officials avoided language that suggested intrusion. They leaned toward environmental explanations: shifting structures, freeze, thaw cycles, animals brushing past the door. But none of it fit cleanly. The bolt shouldn't have released itself. The chair shouldn't have moved without leaving marks. The dust path shouldn't exist at all. One trooper, older than the rest, reviewed the hunter's file late into the night. The man had been meticulous, logged his routines, photographed the cabin every season. In every image, the door was shut tight, always locked, always the same chair position, the same small habits repeated year after year, like a ritual. The trooper paused on a note from the final season, a sentence scribbled in the margin of a supply list. Heard something outside last night. Didn't sound like weather. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, it meant too much. The cabin was sealed again after the inspection. Locked, marked, left alone. But the feeling lingered. The sense that the door hadn't opened to let something in. It had opened, because something had finished waiting. The reopened case drew a different kind of attention. Not the urgency of a rescue, not the noise of media. Just quiet curiosity from people who had spent enough time in Alaska to know when explanations were being stretched thin. Locals spoke in half sentences. Troopers avoided speculation. Everyone agreed on one thing: the cabin hadn't been disturbed by accident. They returned a week later. The door was still closed. The lock intact. Snowmelt pooled around the foundation, undisturbed. Inside, nothing had changed, except the chair. It was no longer facing the door. It had been turned slightly, angled toward the window. Not much. Just enough to suggest adjustment rather than chance. No new footprints appeared in the dust. No fingerprints on the wood. No fibers. Nothing that could be collected, bagged, or explained. It was as if the cabin itself had shifted its attention, while no one was watching. They searched farther this time, miles out in every direction. Aerial sweeps, ground teams. Dogs brought in and rotated out when their behavior grew inconsistent. Stopping abruptly, circling, refusing to follow scent trails that seemed to lead nowhere. One handler described it as trying to track something that wasn't moving through space in a way dogs understood. The hunter's rifle was never found, nor his pack, nor his body. The only thing that returned was the sense that the disappearance hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual. That night, the older trooper dreamed of the cabin. In the dream, the door opened slowly, not pushed, not pulled, simply allowed to move. Cold air entered, then silence. No footsteps, no figures. Just the sense that something had stepped out, leaving behind a space that no longer needed guarding. He woke before dawn and wrote nothing about the dream in his report. Back at headquarters, someone noticed another detail buried in old records. Satellite imagery taken 2 years after the hunter vanished showed a faint heat anomaly near the cabin. Not enough to trigger alarms. Too small to matter. It was dismissed at the time as sensor noise. Now, looking again, it appeared in the exact spot where the chair had been positioned. As if something had been there. Waiting. The case stalled again, not because it was solved, but because it refused to move forward. No evidence meant no conclusions. Alaska swallowed another name into its long list of unsolved absences. But the cabin was different now. Rangers assigned to the area avoided it instinctively. Pilots circled wider than necessary. No one admitted why. They didn't need to. The structure had become a marker, not of danger, but of attention, of something that had once been contained, or anchored, or simply present. And then, late one night in early autumn, a storm rolled through the interior. High winds, sudden temperature drop, the kind of weather that rearranged the landscape without warning. When it passed, a patrol flew out to check on remote structures. The cabin door was open again, wider this time. The patrol didn't land right away. They circled first, low and slow, scanning for anything that would justify keeping distance. From above, the cabin looked unchanged. Roof intact, walls steady, snow pushed back unevenly by wind. But the door stood open wide enough to be unmistakable, dark interior exposed to daylight for the first time in years. No tracks, not from animals, not from people. Not even the scattered impressions waned, usually left behind. The ground around the threshold was clean, in a way that felt deliberate, as if the moment of opening had occurred without contact. When they finally sat down, no one rushed in. Protocol said secure the structure. Instinct said wait. Inside, the air felt colder than it should have been, even for Alaska. Not the sharp cold of winter, but a flat absence of warmth, like a room that had never learned how to hold it. The dust was still there, thick, undisturbed, except for the same narrow path leading inward. The chair had moved again. This time, it wasn't facing the door or the window. It was turned toward the back wall, angled slightly down, as if focused on something low and unseen. The table beside it bore a new mark, not fresh damage, but a faint indentation in the wood, like something heavy had rested there for a long time and only recently been lifted. They'd found the journal then. It hadn't been there before, at least not where it now lay, open on the table, pages warped slightly from cold but readable. The last entries were unfamiliar. Handwriting matched the hunter's, but the tone didn't. No dates, no context, just observations. It doesn't come inside unless I stop moving. It listens when I sit. The door matters more than I thought. The final line was written darker than the rest, pressed hard enough to score the page. If I leave it open, it won't follow. They closed the journal carefully. Outside, the wind picked up again, low and steady, pushing through the trees without direction. One of the troopers glanced back at the cabin and felt an irrational certainty. Not that someone was watching, but that something had finished being watched. The door was closed before they left. Locked, bolted, sealed the way it always had been. That night, hundreds of miles away, a satellite registered a brief thermal bloom in the Alaskan interior. Small, localized, gone before any system flagged it for review. 5 years after the hunter vanished, the cabin stood empty once more. But whatever had kept the door closed with him inside was no longer there. They never published the journal. Officially, it was deemed unreliable. Stress-induced writing, isolation psychosis, narrative drift common in prolonged solitude. The pages were scanned, logged and archived under a classification few people ever revisited. The cabin, however, could not be dismissed so easily, because it stayed quiet after that. Not abandoned, quiet in a way that felt resolved. For the next 2 years, patrol flights reported nothing unusual. The door remained closed. The lock held. Snow built up naturally against the frame and melted away in spring without disturbance. No heat anomalies. No unexplained movement. The chair was found, exactly where it had last been documented, angled toward the back wall, untouched. It was as if the cabin had exhaled. Then, 5 months after the journal was discovered, a man walked into a ranger station nearly 300 miles south of the original site. He was thin, weathered, older than his file photograph suggested. His beard was untrimmed, his hands scarred in familiar ways, the kind of marks that came from long familiarity with cold and tools. He gave his name calmly. It matched the hunter's. At first, they assumed a mistake. Identity theft. Delusion. Someone who had read too much about an unsolved case. But fingerprints matched. Dental records matched. A scar on his forearm from a childhood accident, noted decades earlier, matched perfectly. He had not aged the way 5 years should have marked him. He aged less. When asked where he had been, he gave an answer that stopped the interview cold. "Inside," he said. "Not the cabin. Inside the boundary." He explained it slowly, carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might reopen something that had finally closed. He said the land had a way of noticing stillness. That movement distracted it, but attention anchored it. The cabin, he realized too late, had become a kind of door not just for entry, but for focus. He said something had been there long before him. Not a creature, not a presence in the human sense. A condition. A listening. It didn't pursue. It didn't hunt. It waited for someone to stop long enough to define themselves against it. He survived by never leaving the threshold, never fully inside, never fully gone. When the door opened years later, it wasn't escape. It was release. They asked why he hadn't come back sooner. He shook his head. "Because time wasn't moving the same way," he said. "And because I wasn't sure it wouldn't follow." They asked if it could. He didn't answer. The cabin was dismantled quietly that summer, burned down to ash under supervision. The site restored to something unremarkable. No marker. No report released to the public. The case was closed again, this time with a living signature. The hunter declined interviews. Declined compensation. He took a job far from the interior, near the coast, where land met water and boundaries dissolved naturally. Sometimes, when storms came in from the sea, he left his door open. Not out of fear, but out of respect. The epilogue didn't arrive as an explanation. It arrived as an absence of recurrence. Years passed without another report tied to that stretch of the interior. No doors opening where they shouldn't. No heat signatures blooming and vanishing. No journals written in margins that tried to name what refused names. Whatever had been bound to that cabin did not relocate. It did not migrate. It did not look for a substitute. It ended where it had begun. The hunter kept his life small after that. He lived near the coast, in a place where weather announced itself clearly and boundaries moved in visible ways. Tides came and went. Storms gathered and broke. Nothing lingered without motion. He worked, ate, slept, and learned how to exist without listening for something beneath the world. He never hunted again. Not because he feared the land, but because he understood it too well now. He knew the difference between moving through a place and settling into its attention. He knew how easily stillness could become an invitation. Sometimes, at night, he woke with the sensation that something had paused just outside his door. Not waiting. Just remembering. On those nights, he left the door open and went back to sleep. Nothing ever crossed the threshold. In Alaska, the site where the cabin once stood returned to its earlier state. Grass grew unevenly where ash had been scattered. Snow erased the last straight lines. Within a few seasons, there was nothing left to suggest a man had ever anchored anything there. Pilots flew over without circling. Rangers stopped mentioning the case. The journal pages remained archived, rarely requested. Harder to interpret the longer they sat untouched. Words written to hold something in place lost their grip once the thing itself had moved on. And that was the quiet truth beneath it all. The land had not taken him. The cabin had not trapped him. He had simply stayed long enough to notice something that most people passed without consequence, and then learned how to let it go without being followed. Doors matter, he had written. They still did, not as barriers, but as agreements. And once the agreement was finished, the world resumed its ordinary shape, wide, cold, indifferent, and safe enough for those who knew when to keep moving. Nothing else happened, which was the surest sign that it was finally over. The story didn't surface again the way unfinished stories usually do. There were no late discoveries, no hikers stumbling across something preserved by cold, no second man walking out of the interior with a similar explanation. Alaska, once it finishes with something, rarely repeats itself in the same place. But echoes don't need repetition to exist. Years after the cabin was gone, a graduate researcher studying long-term wilderness isolation interviewed the hunter as part of a broader project. The conversation was meant to be clinical. Coping mechanisms, perception changes, time distortion. She asked careful questions and expected abstract answers. At the end, she asked one thing off record. Do you think it's still there? He didn't hesitate. No, he said. I think it was never there the way you mean. She asked what he meant by that. He thought for a long moment before answering. Some places don't contain things, he said. They concentrate them. Attention, stillness, intention. I didn't meet something new. I met what happens when you stop long enough in the wrong place. She didn't include that in her paper. Not because she didn't believe him, but because there was no language for it that wouldn't turn it into myth. And myth invited people to look for it, which was the one thing he had learned never to do. Back near the old site, hunters still passed through the region every season. Snowmobiles cut new lines through familiar valleys. Camps rose and fell. Fires burned and went cold. No one lingered where the cabin had been, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to linger on. One winter, a storm revealed something briefly. A rectangular shadow under fresh snow, visible only from the air for a few hours before drifting shut again. A pilot noticed it, frowned, and kept flying. By the time he mentioned it later, the coordinates no longer mattered. The land had smoothed itself over. That was how it preferred things. As for the hunter, he aged normally after that, slowly, uneventfully. The difference between him and everyone else was not visible unless you knew where to look. He moved often, never stayed too long in one place, kept doors functional, windows unblocked. He understood flow now, air, people, time. Nothing stayed trapped. Sometimes, when people asked him why he never spoke publicly about what happened, he gave a simple answer. Because stories teach people to stop, he said. And stopping is how it starts. They laughed, assuming metaphor. He let them. In Alaska, the interior remained vast and uninterested. Weather erased mistakes faster than memory ever could. Whatever had once required a boundary no longer needed one. And the quiet that followed wasn't ominous. It was complete. Nothing marked the end. No final report. No ceremony. No line in an archive declaring the matter finished. The case simply stopped casting a shadow long enough for the world to step out of it. The hunter lived the rest of his life in motion, not restlessly, deliberately. He chose places where doors opened easily, where paths curved instead of ending, where weather announced itself before arriving. He learned to recognize the difference between solitude and stillness, and he never confused them again. When he spoke about Alaska, which was rare, he didn't describe fear. He described patience. He said the land had taught him that waiting was not passive, that some forms of attention pressed back when acknowledged, shaping the space around them. He said, "Most people pass through wilderness without consequence, because they never stopped long enough to become part of its focus." He had, and then he hadn't. That distinction mattered more than survival. Years later, when he died, quietly, in a coastal town far from the interior, no one connected his name to the old case. The files had been sealed, then buried under newer ones. The cabin existed only as a footnote in an internal log, its coordinates overwritten by maintenance, updates, and seasonal surveys. The place where it once stood became ordinary again, not reclaimed, released. In Alaska, storms continued to arrive without warning. Rivers shifted their courses. Snow buried things and revealed others, always without intent. Hunters came and went. Cabins were built and dismantled. Doors opened and closed for reasons no one questioned. And nothing else answered. That was the final proof, not that something dangerous had been contained, but that something unfinished had been allowed to finish itself. The interior did not remember the hunter, but it no longer needed him. And he, having learned the cost of stillness in the wrong place, had spent the rest of his life honoring the simplest rule the land had taught him: keep moving. Keep boundaries honest, and never mistake silence for emptiness. Because some silences are complete, and once complete, they do not call again.